Next question we have Adam. Is there a reason Erickson much preferred indirect suggestions as opposed to direct, other than the fact that it works on a vast majority of personality types while you're inducing hypnosis, as it gives the analytical type less opportunity to resist? And he continues here, also, do you think indirect suggestions are more effective for change when clients are in trance? I like to use both methods, but predominantly direct, as this is how I was trained. Okay. So two questions really here, I think, Adam. Okay, let's take the first one. Is there a reason why he preferred indirect suggestions as opposed to direct? Well, first of all, if you look into Erickson's early work, he was fairly direct. He was, in fact, quite direct, but it wasn't in the terms of being authoritarian in, the tonality and the power of the hypnotist. It was direct in terms of being emphatic. Understand what I mean by that? It's like, I have this task for you. I want you to go and do ABC. This will happen, and when you do this, I'd like you to notice that, and that. Okay, so he was direct in the sense of giving instructions very clearly. As he got older and weaker and ill, really, because of his illnesses, he became more indirect. And I think when all of those psychologists and students studied with him in the 70s, it was really him, really feeling very, very weak. And so he would be quite economical in his work. And so the students thought, this is what we have to do. We have to be indirect all the time. And I think probably he enjoyed that, just sitting there mumbling at them and watching them going into trance. But in fact, he was quite direct, before. And let me say something else. Once somebody is in hypnosis, you can be fairly direct because you've already got the unconscious on your side, if you know what I mean. But when you start with a person who's fully consciously aware of everything going on and you're very direct, it's almost like you're opposing your will on them. And a lot of people don't like that unless they have this concept where if I'm told what to do, I'm going to go into trance. If they have that firm belief and they are receptive, then the direct approach will work. But it's the ethics behind being a direct that I'm not happy with, in terms of what it implies that someone has control over you, that the client can't do something themselves, things like this. So in terms of Erickson, he would use both. And especially when he's giving tasks, you'd have to be quite direct. So let's look at that question again, Adam. Why is there a reason why he preferred indirect suggestions? Well, I think I kind of answered that. That kind of evolved in his work. And yes, it can appeal to most personality types because the client doesn't even know what you're really doing, of course, because you're indirect. So it's not going to get the kind of maybe resistance or that kind of conscious monitoring that you normally have when someone's expecting to feel suddenly to go into trance. Yes, and true, if you're an analytical type, might want to resist or be too conscious. So indirect would benefit, obviously, the clients in that way. The second part of your question, Adam, is do you think indirect suggestions are more effective for change when clients are in trance? Well, it depends, doesn't it? First of all, as I've already said, once the client's in hypnosis, if they're in a good depth of hypnosis, you can be fairly direct because you're bypassing the conscious mind anyway, once they're in a good hypnotic state. So you can be quite direct. I don't mean authoritarian direct. I mean in the sense of Erickson, being quite direct, quite emphatic, clear, specific instructions, post-hypnotic suggestions. So are indirect suggestions more effective? Well, there are different ways you give suggestions. You can tell somebody something, and if they're very responsive hypnotically, they'll go and do it. Okay. Even so, you don't know really. It's very difficult to tell how deep a trance and how receptive they are until you know them after a while, you work with them. And at that point, you don't know. So if you're using indirect suggestion, it might be a safer bet to get the results you want. The other thing is, of course, if you're using metaphors and storytelling, which is a wonderful way of doing therapy, that is an indirect approach. it's a difference between telling somebody, I want you to go and do ABC, and telling someone a story about someone else who went and did ABC. And there's a little bunny rabbit and a hedgehog or something doing ABC. It's like a fairy tale metaphor. The learnings and teachings that we have embedded in metaphors is centuries old. It's something that we're all familiar with. It's almost in our DNA. So I think as a teaching and as a therapeutic tool, it's wonderful. So you wouldn't be direct. If you were giving a metaphor, you wouldn't just tell them what you wanted them to do in a metaphor. You'd actually be quite artfully vague and have the metaphor give the indirect suggestion at the second level. So really there's a room for both in terms of once the person's in trance, definitely. But when I say direct, I'm not talking about authoritarian, where the hypnotist has control and power and sleep, all this stuff. No, I'm talking simply about being emphatic, being clear and direct with your suggestions. Okay, Adam, I hope that's been of some benefit. And thank you very much for your question. It's a great question, or great question.